Hi everybody, welcome to Speedway Motors and the Museum of American Speed. My name's Tim and I'm always so glad when you can join us. We're here in the main facility here at the museum in our what we like to call our open wheel room, and we have a very special guest today, somebody that we are happy to consider a friend of the museum, Mike Lashmett, and we're here in front of the Johnny Lightning IndyCar to talk about not only Mike and his background, but a little bit of his history with the car, which is pretty cool. We've been talking about this all of last night and into this morning, and we thought it'd be pretty cool to do a video and just talk a little bit about the history behind the car for future generations. We have it here being conserved in the museum, and it's got a really rich history. And Mike, I guess we'll just start off by maybe talking a little bit about your background and how you got involved in Indy cars.
Well, I got involved in Indy cars. I grew up in a little farm town, a county seat by the name of Pittsfield, Illinois is the name of the town, in Pike County, west central Illinois. And I had an uncle there who was a Shell gas station operator, but also a super modified builder and driver. And so at a very young age, my aunt and uncle started taking me to the races before they had any of their own children. I think I was about 5 or 6, and that kind of got me hooked. And it got me hooked for life, actually. And it's been my passion, and been my interest. I'm 64 years old, so for all these years, 60 plus years probably.
That passion always keeps you going. I talk to a lot of hot rodders. We go around and do shows all over the country, and it doesn't matter your age. You're always going to do one more car, or get one more experience in, and it is just this driving force in your life, I've found.
Well, I was fortunate enough to be involved in IndyCar racing, and at a great point in IndyCar history. And then I got out of it, but I always remained a fan and remained a person that was very interested in the sport. Had a lot of friends and contact in the sport, and about a year and a half ago, a friend of mine invited me out to Dan Gurney's AAR shop, and I hadn't been there in about 40 years, to have lunch and see Dan's collection and whatnot, and one thing led to another, and the friend is Philippe de Lispinay, and he invited me to go back to Indy for Legends Day with him. He owns one of the 72 Olsenite Eagles, Offie engine cars, and I went back and helped him, and one thing led to another, and now I find myself very involved in the whole vintage IndyCar scene. And Ron Nelson, a friend of mine, and I started the Vintage Indy Registry. It's a registry for vintage Indy cars, and the Johnny Lightning car, your car, is in the registry. And it's just kind of caused a whole new rebirth of an interest with me in the sport, and find that a lot of people are interested in talking to me. And
absolutely. I know we certainly are, and I'm glad you mentioned the registry, because you showed that to me a little bit last night, and wow, I mean, there's some rich history in there. A lot of research has gone into that, and I learned things about this car last night when I went home. I got on, learned so many things about this car that as a curator of a museum, I should have known that already, but and it just goes to show what a great website you've developed for the registry. I mean, there's so many cars in there you can research.
I'll give it a plug, vintageindyregistry.com. There's also an accompanying Facebook page. There's a plethora of vintage photographs and new photographs of restored cars at different events. For instance, this year Phoenix, and Legends Day at Indianapolis, SVRA Indy. We were just in Pocono last weekend, and there's quite a movement there, and there's literally hundreds of vintage Indy cars out there, many of which have been absolutely stunningly restored and are back running again for the public and future generations to enjoy.
Oh, and nothing gives you the fever like hearing one of these cars run. We just got back from the Miller meet, and seeing these cars, run around the Milwaukee Mile, and hearing an Offie engine, for instance, is a great experience for somebody like myself. I grew up, I was born in '77, so this all predates me a little bit. So to kind of be a part of that history it's really cool, and that's why I think I'm glad you mentioned the registry, because trying to preserve the history of racing in the United States. Such a rich history, and you watch racing now. We've talked a little bit about that, how it's changed over time, and what do you think modern day racing is missing that vintage racing had going for it?
Well, I think, I love IndyCar racing. I love where IndyCar racing's at right now, and I love where it's going. I love the style of the cars and the bodywork that Dallara has come out with for next year, and I think that IndyCar racing's strong and only going forward. I do miss the innovation. I do miss all of and many fans do, and they'll tell you this candidly, that they miss all the innovation, the different chassis, the different engines, a big part of Indianapolis every year was going to the Speedway and seeing this combination of all these different things that people had created and come up with, and you know, that was part of the allure to about Indianapolis, actually.
Yeah. So you were actually a crew member on this car. How did that all come about?
Well, divine intervention. We were with Clay Smith earlier upstairs, and we were talking about Bill Smith and how he amassed this collection. And I think Clay mentioned that his dad thought some of it was divine intervention, and I'd have to say almost in my case the same thing. I mean, I had a passion for this as a child, and I was fortunate enough to take that interest that my uncle kind of fostered in me and go-kart racing as a young kid, and happened to grow up near Quincy, Illinois, which was a hotbed for karting and TNT Kartways, and Gus Trader and Terry Trader, and they hosted a lot of IKF national championships there, and I grew up racing there, and in the St. Louis area and over in Springfield, Illinois, there was a circuit called the ILMO. This is in the late 60s, and as nature would have it, the go-kart thing, got interested in cars and all this sort of thing. And by the time I graduated from high school in 1971, I was bent on going to work for an IndyCar team by hook or by crook, so to speak. And my parents kind of thought, my family thought I was a little maybe crazy to think this way, but I knew that Indianapolis was less than 300 miles away to the east, and I had been there and had a pretty good working knowledge from studying the history of Indy and who the chief mechanics were and where their shops were located, either in California, Indianapolis and whatnot, and of course the drivers and the car combinations and things like that. So when I graduated from high school in 1971, I went to Indianapolis and started knocking on doors.
Wow.
I went to A.J. Watson's shop and Bill Finley's and Grant King's and just everybody, and kind of got pointed in the direction once I got over there and see if I could find a job. And it was coming towards the end of the 71 season, and no one was hiring. I was an 18-year-old kid, and whatnot, and it was a long shot, but nonetheless, I went over there. The interesting part of the story is I knew where the Vels Parnelli Jones shop was, George Bignotti's shop down on 15th Street, and I drove down there, but I was afraid to go in. I was afraid to go there, They were like the biggest team in the sport at the time and had just won back-to-back Indy 500s, and so I didn't go in. Well, when I went over there for these few days to see if I could find a job, I stayed at the Speedway Motel, which wasn't very expensive back in those days. I think it was $11 a night or something like that. And of course, I'd go in the restaurant every morning and eat breakfast before I'd start going out and beating the pavement. And there was a woman that worked there that was a secretary to Tony Holman, and her name was Rosemary Ensley, lovely lady. And she had talked to me a couple different mornings in the lobby, where are you from and what's going on and this and that. And she was probably about my mother's age, maybe a little bit older. And I told her I was there to find a job with an IndyCar team. And she just kind of nodded her head and whatnot. And so to make a long story short, I didn't find a job on that trip over there, and I'd given myself about 5 days, and that's all I had enough money for. So I went home and went back to Illinois, and Monday morning, the phone rang at my parents' kitchen, and my mom answered it, and she told me the phone was for me. Well, it was Rosemary Ensley from the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Motel, and Mr. Holman had an apartment, Mr. and Mrs. Holman, above the lobby and the restaurant there at the Speedway, and she was one of his secretaries, and she informed me in this phone conversation that George Bignotti came in for breakfast every morning, and that she had mentioned me to George Bignotti.
Wow.
7-time Indy 500 winning crew chief. Not at that point. I think he only had 5 wins at that point. But she had mentioned me to him, and that he was looking for somebody. And if I could get back over there, there's a chance I might have a job.
Yeah, I bet you couldn't gas the car up
I
fast
couldn't gas
enough.
the car quick enough. I think I borrowed. My mom will tell you. I went to her office, and she was the county health nurse. Her office was in the courthouse. I went up to her office and borrowed $20, and I was gone. I had a Volkswagen Beetle, and I drove back over to Indianapolis and went straight to Vels Parnelli Jones shop, and I walked in. Of course, there was George Bignotti and Johnny Caples and Jimmy Dillamarter and Charlie Tabucci, the engine man. They were all there, and they're all wearing Johnny Lightning uniforms, and there's all the Johnny Lightning cars, the dirt car and the Samsonite car, and I was just like, oh my gosh.
Isn't that something?
And it was a Taj Mahal of race car shops at the time, and so there was George, and I walked right up to him and introduced myself, and we had a chat, and he hired me on the spot for $100 a week.
Wow.
And I went to work the next day, and he asked me if I had a place to live, and I said, no, I have no idea, and I don't have very much money. And he gave me this address of this elderly woman out in Speedway. I think her name was Stella Hazelwood, and she lived next door to Pat Vidan, the Indy flagman. I mean,
Oh, wow.
can you believe this?
Isn't that something?
She had her basement set up like a dormitory for racers. Bill Simpson had stayed there, and a lot of people from California coming through driving sprint cars and guys trying to make it at Indy and whatnot. And so she had this basement set up as a dormitory, and I think she charged $25 a month.
Wow.
So he sent me over there. I knocked on her door, and I think he had called ahead of time, and so she rented me a space down in her basement, a bed, and there was a little kitchenette set up and a bathroom. And at the time down there, Jack Ford was living there. He was a mechanic with Patrick Racing. There was a whole lot of race car people there, and that's how I started out, and went to work the next day. And this was at the tail end of the Johnny Lightning era, and so I was put in the hands of Jimmy Dillemarter and John Caples, and two iconic mechanics at Indy, and of course George Bignotti was there, and
Wow.
started out with them, and
What a great story.
that's how I got involved.
Let that be a lesson to you kids. If you want something bad enough, you just go for it. I mean, it's so amazing, that story, just wanting something bad enough and just, knocking on doors, and then just the kindness of one person. Like you say, divine intervention is about the only way you can explain it. But once you were on the team, I would imagine it just kept getting better, right? Just being
Well, I was
involved
the
with
low
all
man
those
on the
guys.
totem pole, obviously, and this was a really established team. And I think George handed me over to Jimmy Dillemarter, so I was on Al's car, and on the last Johnny Lightning Special, 71 car towards the end of the season, and then made the transition. The Johnny Lightning sponsorship ended at the end of 71, and we made the transition over to the Viceroy cars, and the first three Viceroy cars were 1971 Vels Parnelli Joan PJ Colts. So the Johnny Lightning paint job had to come off those cars, and the Viceroy paint job had to go on, and we heavily modified those cars. Al's car already had an Offie in it, turbo Offie, but Joe's didn't, and then a third car had to be built for Mario Andretti, who had joined the team. And I had the job, one of my jobs at the end of the season was to strip the Johnny Lightning paint job off the 71
boy.
winner, which was a heartbreaker.
Oh, I bet.
And I stripped that thing completely down to bare metal and took the tub back down to bare aluminum, and then we started from there. And
Wow.
of course, George Gruber painted all the cars for, he was a fantastic sign painter, race car letterer, race car painter of legendary proportions in Indianapolis. And he came up with a Viceroy scheme, and we painted the cars over and totally changed them
Wow.
to go into 72.
When you switched from the Cammer Ford engine to the Offie engine, I think I've read a little bit about how the chassis just didn't like to hold up to the Offie engine. It shook a little bit more, a little more vibration. Or what was the story behind that?
Well, most people will tell you that at low RPMs, the Offie's kind of rough. It vibrates a lot and smooths out as it picks up RPM. But the motor mounts obviously had to be changed. For 71, when we changed those Colts over, McLaren was kind of the hot car then, and they had side-mounted radiators and big rear wings, and USAC allowed the big rear wing and front wings for the first time in 72. So those were all changes that were incorporated into that 71 Colt of Al's and Joe Leonard's, and the car they built out for Mario. So on Al's car, we had two side-mounted radiators, kind of McLaren style, with fairings. Eldon Rasmussen came to the shop at night. He hand-formed all the aluminum for the fairings for those side-mounted radiators. I think Eldon was involved in building the big rear wing for the conversion, and Al's car already had an Offie in it. They had changed mid-season. I think it was after Pocono. They'd gone from Ford to Offie power because that was where everybody was going with more horsepower. And Mike McQueen was our fiberglass guy at the Vels Parnelli Jones shop out in Torrance. There were two shops, and he had made a new nose that was more wedge-shaped. And I think we kept a small front radiator in that 71 Colt, added the side-mounted radiators and the big rear wing, front rear wings. And the premiere for that car was in December at the Speedway Motel. There was a big party there, a press junket for announcing Brown Williamson Tobacco Company out of Louisville, and Viceroy Cigarettes as the primary sponsor for the team going into 72. And we displayed the car that night in a tent for the press, and we just barely finished the car. I think, in fact, some of the lettering was still wet. Gruber had just finished it that day earlier.
Yeah, wow. You told me a cool story about how you were the guy that usually got to sit in the seat because you were about the same size as Al Unser.
Well,
is that right?
I was the the gopher on the team, the young guys. So yeah, when we put the cars on a setup pad, we had a setup pad at 15th Street, and we'd put the cars on the setup pad for wherever we were going with the car. And so Dillamarter or Big Naughty would usually have me sit in the car so that there was driver weight in there, so to speak. Al and I probably weighed about the same amount of weight at that time. So
Yeah.
I was taller than Al. I didn't fit in the car. The pedals were moved back for him, and I kind of had long legs. He wasn't real comfortable, but yeah.
Well, being involved with this car, you've researched pretty heavily the Johnny Lightning sponsorship and how that all came about. Hot Wheels, correct me if I'm wrong, they started in about 68, 69, and then...
Late 67, 68, I think they hit the market with, Mattel did with Hot Wheels.
And then Johnny Lightning was, they were trying to kind of go down the same path, but you told me some pretty interesting facts about how many Hot Wheels were sold compared to Johnny Lightning cars.
Yeah, there's so much fascinating detail about all of this involving Johnny Lightning. To back the story up, we talked a bit about this yesterday here at the museum. Henry Ornstein from Elizabeth, New Jersey, who was a Holocaust survivor and a fabulous entrepreneur, he had a business called Deluxe Reading Company, and out of that grew Topper Toys. And Topper Toys at that time, they were really good at copying other sorts of toys but selling them for a lot less money in different venues. For instance, at Christmas time on the top shelf at grocery stores, they'd have the Dawn doll and different Topper toys, and otherwise you might not see Topper in stores. But he took note of the Mattel's Hot Wheels success and came up with the idea of the Johnny Lightning cars as a competitor. And they produced, I think, 56 or 58 different models only of the Johnny Lightning car over the run of the thing. And Velis Parnelli Jones at that time had a PR man, a former Firestone guy by the name of Jim Cook, and he had set up an office in Torrance, and he was kind of the sponsor headhunter for Vel and Parnelli. And Vel and Parnelli and Jim Cook all lived up in Palos Verdes Peninsula, where a lot of the Mattel toy executives lived, Mattel being based in Hawthorne, right next to Torrance. And so Jim Cook had approached Mattel and the Hot Wheels people about sponsorship, but they never bit. So Jim Cook had learned of this startup competitor out in New Jersey called Topper Toys and Johnny Lightning, and so he went out and called on Henry Ornstein and pitched him, and I've been told that Ornstein at the end of the pitch only had one question, and that question was, who's going to win the 1970 Indy 500? And the answer to that Jim Cook gave him was Al Unser's going to win it in the Johnny Lightning Special. Henry Ornstein was sold on the sponsorship deal, and he had the vision to see, how these cars could be decorated and painted, the livery could be turned out, and then the vision to create this entire product line of accessories and promotion and television commercials and drawing in the Indy drivers in the commercials and really promoting the brand. And he did all that successfully, and then of course the car won the 70 Indy 500. So they had all that to add into their ad campaign, both print and TV. And I've been told by many sources that after Al won the 70 Indy 500 in the Johnny Lightning Colt, that with their advertising campaign, that Topper closed the gap on sales with the cars, which you mentioned. And prior to the Indy 500 win, Mattel Hot Wheels outsold Johnny Lightning 25-1. So 25 Hot Wheel cars were sold and one Johnny Lightning. But after the win and the blitz of advertising and all the fanfare that was created from the win with the kids, Topper closed that gap 10-1 or 15-1, I forget the exact number, but they narrowed it, considerably just based on the win and the success of that sponsorship.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
And so many cool products. You even brought us some for the museum, really cool car case, that would have held little Johnny Lightning cars that was shaped just like the winning car.
Just exactly like this car.
Unbelievable.
They had helmets and goggles and, car carry case. There was a lunchbox with a thermos. Posters, stickers,
little patches,
little patches. I brought you one of the patches in
so
the original
cool.
packaging, and there was all this tie-in product, and it was all Topper that and Henry Ornstein and his company that had the vision to do that, and promote it. And I really don't think that anybody had ever done that with any kind of race car to the extent that he had done it at that time. It's kind of groundbreaking. I mean, he was in that same vein as Andy Granatelli in promoting STP, and he really ran with it. Ran with the success of all the wins, and then more wins in a national championship, and then a second Indy 500 win, 71.
Yeah, and it created such an iconic vehicle. I mean, when people come to the museum and they see this, they're immediately blown away. Wow, that's the car. Of course, they're always thinking that it's the car that actually won the Indy 500.
Yeah.
And and that kind of brings into play, how many cars were there? How many Johnny Lightning cars, and which one's which? How do you tell the difference? And
well, for me, it's easy to tell the difference because I've studied them and I was around them and got to lay my hands on them over the years. But this car actually is a Lola, and it's correctly called a Lola T150-2 because it's the second one that was built. And George Bignotti, who was a chief mechanic for the Retzloff Chemical IndyCar team in '68 and '67, he had won Indy in '66 with a Lola, an Eric Broadley car with Graham Hill, and then bought new '67 Lola T92s for Al and the team. And then in '68 they ordered 2 more new cars. And this was the second of the 2 cars. They were both delivered about the same time. They were delivered late, I've been told by Jimmy Dillemarter. They came, I think, either early May or late April, so they didn't have a lot of time to prep them and turn them out. But the other car was assigned to Carl Williams. It was a 4-cam Ford engine, but normally aspirated. And it was a number 5 red car, Retzloff Chemical car. And then this car, which was assigned to Al Unser, and this was a number 24 red Retzloff Chemical car. And the difference between the 2 cars was that this was a 4-wheel drive car. 4-wheel drive was allowed by USAC in that era, and it was pretty innovative at the time. And Hewlin made the setup, both the gearbox and the front-wheel drive system that bolted on the front bulkhead. And when they went to the Speedway in '68, Williams had the rear-wheel drive only car. Unser had this car. Carl Williams had kept complaining about his car and the handling and whatnot. Bignotti put Al in it to send him out and to check it out, and the car was put in the wall, unfortunately, and badly damaged. In fact, I've heard people almost say it was close to totaled. Pardon me. But so Carl Williams was out of a ride, and Al still had this 4-wheel drive red 24 Retzloff car, which he ran in the race till I was told by his brother Bobby that a brake rotor exploded and it put Al in the wall.
Oh, wow.
So this car was damaged, and after the Indy 500, shipped back to England to Lola to be repaired. And of course the other brand new Lola was wrecked as well. And so they didn't have a '68 Lola to go forward with in the season after Indy. So they reverted back to the old '67 Lola T92. Yeah. And Al ran that at Milwaukee and Langhorne, and I think about 4 races. I'd have to look at the record book. But by the time that IRP came around, the race at Indianapolis Raceway Park on the road course in July, this car was back and repaired. Al was back in it, 4-wheel drive setup, but for the road race, they would always go back to a normally aspirated Ford. You didn't have the turbo lag that affected you and slowed you down on the road course. So Al drove this repaired car back from Lola in July of 1968 at IRP, and he won both heats there and put it on pole for one of them.
Wow.
And that turned out to be Al Unser's first ever rear-engine IndyCar win this car.
That's great.
In 1968. So that's where, the history really starts at Indianapolis with this car, but the win at IRP is substantial, being that it's Al Unser's first ever rear-engine IndyCar win. And he went on a roll with this car for the rest of the '68 season. I brought you the data on it yesterday, but this car went on to be used by Valspar and Ellie Jones in '68, '69, and '70, and it has 11 pole positions with Al Unser in it and 10 wins.
Wow.
And Donald Davidson, a Speedway historian, believes it's probably one of the winningest Indy cars ever campaigned. So that adds to the rich history of it as well. 3 Indy 500 starts.
Kind of gives you
and
chills.
Actually 4 Indy 500 starts, because Sammy Sessions drove the car at Indianapolis in '71, this same car.
Wow, unbelievable.
So this car has crossed the United States of America so many times it's probably lost count. And you folks have had it in Indianapolis for the SVRA deal the past couple of summers, and
And it's been wonderful to be able to do that, to bring it out, let it sit under the sunshine. You know, we're always questioning, you know, when you have a car that has such a race history, do you ever let it out of the museum? Of course, if we wouldn't have done that, we wouldn't have, you know, bumped into you and created this wonderful relationship and had you back to the museum, which has been wonderful.
We haven't talked about that. At one point in time, my wife owned this car,
That's,
and
yeah,
we
absolutely.
brought it back to life and kind of put it back out there, and it went through several hands until Bill Smith, the founder of Speedway Motors and the Museum of American Speed, acquired it at an auction at the Peterson. I don't know how many years ago that was, 7 or 8 years ago. My wife and I went to the auction, previewed the car, and were there the day that you folks bought it, and it just keeps coming back into my life, so to speak.
Well, that's pretty cool, and we're glad that it does.